All right, so last Thursday, I released a bonus episode, which is basically the audio from a YouTube video I created on how to use generative AI for your own personal development. And as a continuation of that, I made another YouTube video about the ethical considerations that we need to think about as we continue going down this path of that. And given, again, the connection to this, I thought I would make this a podcast episode as well for listeners. But if you do want to check it out, I'd recommend checking out the video on YouTube. I create a lot of content on YouTube that doesn't always make its way into the podcast, but I thought this one is worth it, especially given all the talking about generative AI right now and the fact I released the last episode. So without further ado, here is that for you. All right. Hey, everyone. Today, I am going to be going into what I would consider a minority report as it relates to advanced AI, which is digging into the ethical concerns and what we can do about those things and what that means for us. So before I get into it, if you like this content or other content I produce, please be sure to subscribe and like the video, share it with somebody while you're at it. Why not? Okay, so getting into this, the reality is this tech has hit mainstream at a pace just unprecedented, in my opinion, for things that have hit the market in the past. So it is moving faster than anything I've ever seen. And the world is trying to catch up, which is almost ironic because there's almost no way you can catch up because the pace at which it's moving is growing exponentially. So trying to catch up sometimes can feel like a fruitless exercise. And in some ways it is. On top of it, this is potentially dangerous stuff that we're dealing with. Now, I'm not trying to freak people out, but the reality is there is tremendous power associated with advanced AI. And like the Peter Parker principle says, with great power comes responsibility. And that's really what I want to talk about today is how do we be responsible with this? Because the reality is there is no going back from where we are today. I've talked about this in a few other videos about like where we are with things. And the reality is the toothpaste is so far out of the tube, it would be impossible to put it back in. And the other unfortunate reality is if you look at history, I can think of countless examples where things have happened. We've charged forward with something only to look back sometimes decades, centuries later and go, what have we done? So this is really a chance to try and get in front of this. And there are voices speaking about the ethical concerns and what do we do about these things. But so much of what I see out there is speaking about this at an ethereal level and talking only about the concerns, which if you're a normal human being, that can feel like, okay, I don't even know what to do with it. Not only because it can feel ethereal, but a lot of the conversations don't actually get into the behavioral side of what do we do about it? What can I individually or corporately do to try and get this right? It's not about stopping it because that's an impossible task, but what can we do to get this right or do it better? And I think as a person who's spent my career at the center of business people in tech, I have the learning bend. I can't not focus on this area. So again, this is what I'm going to get into today. And it's all because I recognize and have seen over the years when people feel like, yeah, I hear you. There may be some legitimacy, but ultimately I don't know what to do. A lot of times what happens is people throw their hands up and say, I can't do anything about it anyway. And my hope is that by watching this, by listening to it, it will change your perspective on, you know what, there is something that you can do. And there is a way you personally can positively influence the way advanced AI makes its way into the world and the way it's used, and that it ultimately and hopefully can be used for good. And we can mitigate, probably not eliminate, but at least mitigate some of the destructive consequences. So I'm going to break it down into 4 main categories, and I'm going to share some thoughts on this to help illustrate in case you go, I hadn't considered that you understand the implications of this, while at the same time then breaking it down to, so what can I as an individual potentially do about this? And it's going to be different depending on who you are, but hopefully we can get through that. So let's start with environmental. Now, you might be thinking what you just said, all these things you're going to do, you're going to try and tie it to something that I can personally do. This one sounds a little bit, you're starting, you might be losing me already. I'm going to ask you to hang in there with me on this. And you know what? If I get into this, I recognize whenever anything starts talking about environmental stuff, this can become a triggering topic. And I'm not making jest at that at all. I just recognize that that's a thing. So if even me bringing up the idea of environmental gives you agita, makes you start feeling, just hit pause, skip to the next section, and then come back to this. But what I would ask is that you come back to this, because what I'm telling you right now is my goal in this is not politically motivated. This has nothing to do. I'm not tying this to climate. I'm not trying to make this a political play, but more so to say, listen, we cannot deny the fact that what's going on with advanced AI has implications on how resources are being used and environmental impact. And that does matter, regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum. So that's what I want to focus on. And when you say, how does advanced AI have, if you're asking that question, let me just tell you that there are a lot of things that we take for granted when it comes to tech, because it is just boop. It's like right in our hands. We didn't have to do anything. And we don't always think about how did it get to this point. And so some of the things that we don't always think about when we think about these advanced AI algorithms is that there is a ton of processing power that goes into building and maintaining these massive, powerful advanced AI engines. And as a result, these things consume tons of CO2. Now, I've listened to a few things, read a few research reports. I'm not going to state exact numbers, but what I'm telling you is it is like exponentially more CO2 being produced by one of these things than a team of people can even produce. Now, you may say, what's the big deal with that? Hopefully you at least go, well, okay, it's doing something that wouldn't be there if we were doing nothing. Now, I'm not advocating we don't do anything, and you'll hear when I get to that point, but the reality is the power and consumption that goes into powering these things is significant. It's massive. Stack on top of that, computers, again, we don't always think about where these things come from. There are minerals and resources that have to be harvested to build these things. And so when you think about it, we're scraping these resources to build these bigger and bigger demands for the technology and the hardware that's required. Now, again, does that have an impact on things? Well, yeah, there's a finite number of resources, and the more we tap into it to try and fuel this ever-growing desire for bigger, better, bolder things, we just have to at least consider that. Like I said, my goal here isn't to say, oh, this is bad, evil, progress, all this, like shut it down. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is we do need to consider, and it doesn't matter where you sit politically, we at least need to care about this and say, you know what, that should be something that we're bringing into the conversation as we consider, is the progress that we're moving at, is the direction we're going, is the pace at which we're doing it? Let's take this into consideration. And that should be something regardless of where you sit. You can at least acknowledge and say, okay, fair point. Let's dig into this. Now, you may be going back to it. Like I said, I want to make this tangible for people. You may be going, okay, maybe I at least acknowledge that it matters and I should care. What on earth am I supposed to do it? I'm not in the hardware manufacturing industry. I don't even work for a company that's producing these advanced AI algorithms. How on earth can I have an impact on it? And here's what I would say. Companies do what's in demand. And so as we become more reliant and more heavily reliant on these things, it's going to create a greater demand. And so as we get more impatient, we demand that it's faster, more accurate, more up to date, just at a breakneck pace, and continue to ask for it to go, 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 go. Well, then what are companies going to do? They're going to scorch the earth to meet that demand. And that is something that we can say and consciously go, you know what? I need to be okay with not always having the latest, the newest, the best. We have to push forward. And I will just tell you in full transparency, that's actually hard for me to say, because I tend to be that person who always wants to have the newest and the greatest, and why can't we make this go faster and do more and things like that. So this is me speaking to myself just as much as I am to anyone listening, to actually take a minute and step back and go, hang on, like what is good enough Or what is a pace that's reasonable rather than faster is better at any cost? And that's just something that I think, just as a humankind, we probably need to take some time and think about this. And as advanced AI continues to go and our reliance just continues to, we need more, faster, we have to actually stop ourselves, because if we don't stop ourselves, the companies are just going to continue meeting that need, because it's a competitive environment and whoever's willing to take the next play. And you may say, well, there's nothing I can do, and it may feel disconnected, but that's not the case. Your voice does matter, and your mindset matters, because you influence the people around you. You influence the people you work with, the people you spend time with. And if we can start to slow ourselves down a bit, which, like I said, this is speaking to myself as much as anyone else, we have an opportunity to actually slow things down and say, hey, let's take some time to evaluate how much is too much and when should we actually pull things back. The other thing that really tangibly you can do, like I said, you are an influencer, whether you realize it or not. People listen to what you say. People take your opinion seriously. So speak up about it. Speak up about, maybe we do need to back things down. Maybe we don't become over reliant and jump into every absolute possibility with this stuff before we really know, hey, where are we at? And you know what? Maybe it's okay if we step into the pool instead of diving in head first. If there is no noise, if nobody makes any noise, if nobody raises flags, if nobody says, hey, can we just stop the crazy train and back up a little bit, then nobody's going to. And so I think it's really important. And that is a simple yet practical thing, just a practical example of something. And this isn't related to advanced AI. I've personally I try not to get the latest and greatest model of every new piece of tech when it comes out, which, let me just tell you, is not easy for me to do. But it's just a simple way that I think all of us can say, hey, maybe we just slow this thing down before we just consume ourselves and leave nothing for ourselves or the generations of the future. All right, I'll stop there because I know it can get really charged and go in a direction, and that's not my intent. My intent is to make everyone just think twice and think cautiously about, what are the environmental impacts of some of these things? Were you even aware they existed? And if so, what can you do to slow things down and make things happen at a more reasonable pace within your span of control? All right, moving on. Let's step into well-being. Now, you may be saying advanced AI and well-being. Well, there are some really complicated ways that we can touch on this one. But let's think about it like this. And this is related to how work happens in organizations. Similar to talking about how these advanced AI algorithms consume massive amounts of power and require massive amounts of natural resources to build the products and all of this. They also require a vast amount of time. Now, we don't always feel this on the consumer end, because by the time it gets to us, the work's been done. And so we're just looking at it going, wow, how convenient is this? I can go type in a web browser, do this for me, and it does it. And we don't take into consideration that that algorithm has to be trained. And it's trained, yes, it's trained on other data, but it has a lot of human oversight when you think about this. And for good reason. We've all seen what happens when AI isn't monitored or trained by human beings who have wisdom and discernment on this stuff. It goes off the rails very quickly. And so when you start to think about that, there's two angles that well-being can come into the light as a major risk for this. So first of all, going back to the pace of change, this is extremely time intensive. What do you think happens when the pace of change continues to go faster and faster and faster and faster? Someone has to be involved in that. And the pace of change just exacerbates that. Some poor people are stuck trying to keep up on a treadmill they literally can't. And if you look at the data on workplace well-being right now, people are already burning out. And there is a lack of folks who have the skills and experience in this space. So there's not that many people in it. Then on top of it, the pace and demand for it is growing faster than they can keep up with. We often see this, and this is just an unfortunate reality, is that when this kind of stuff happens, it is not uncommon for organizations to put profits over the well-being of their people. And again, going back to, we have a role in this, because again, if we're demanding faster, better, I don't care. Just do whatever you got to do to make it the next gen. Where's ChatGPT 4.5? Where's ChatGPT 5? When we do that, we don't always think of the human implications on the people who are actually burning the midnight oil to be going into this. Now, I'll talk about what we can do about this, but there's a second angle to this. And this is okay. I'll get into a little bit of a story here on this. People who are involved in the training of AI algorithms, I don't think people always realize they are exposed to some of the most psychologically destructive content on the planet. Just to share a little bit of a story, I have a friend who works at Meta and is in the division for content moderation. Okay. And again, not getting political here. Not trying to make it about whether they do it right or all that, right? There's opportunity around the board. But the reality is, I have heard firsthand stories of the darkness and ugliness of this content that comes up, that people create, that they make. Someone has to moderate that and intentionally expose themselves to it so that they catch it. And there's no way of going, well, just don't have people do it. Unfortunately, they have to, because we've seen what happens with AI when we don't have that human in the loop going, whoa, we cannot have that in there. Like if the algorithm gets trained on this, it's just going to ramp this up and put this on steroids. So just think about that. I mean, I can share stories of people who actually have ended up with PTSD as a result of the things they've been exposed to. And whether or not it goes that far, it changes you on a cognitive level when you are constantly exposed to this kind of content and you're constantly trying to root out the worst and ugliest and darkest things that exist. And there's really no way around it. So, like I said, if we fail to do this and just go, well, it's too destructive to the people, let's just not do that. Well, then we're going to train AI algorithms that are capable of doing things we could never imagine. And we don't even always have insights into how it's coming to those conclusions based on horrific content. And that's not something that's in the best interest of anyone. Now, again, you may be listening to these going, okay, so I'm not a leader over any of these things. I maybe don't have any connection to this kind of stuff. So yes, in some ways, this can feel a little bit disconnected, but I'm going to try and connect some dots here. So first of all, if you're a tech leader, just avoid these pitfalls in general. Like, be cognitively aware of the pace at which you're driving your teams and the well-being of the folks who are involved in this process. And be sensitive to the fact this is not easy stuff. And quite frankly, right, anyway, I don't need to get into that. But if you are responsible for this, take this seriously. Don't just write this off as, it'll be fine. People will figure it out, or I'll just burn people up and then they can go and then right? That's just this disposable mentality as it comes to people, and people are far too valuable to be treated as a disposable resource. So if you are in that position, take this seriously. For the rest of the world who's going, okay, I know a lot of the people who listen to my content are in the HR, they're in the human-centered leadership space. Be a voice for human-centered leadership. If you think about these examples I've given, these aren't unique to just this space. Okay, if we change our work practices, if we put our HR policies in place in a way that just demonstrates good leadership practices, human-centered thinking, things like this is going to be something that is going to mitigate some of these risks. Can we eliminate it? No, because quite frankly, it's a required thing that has to happen. But can we mitigate what kind of time we're pouring in, the number of staff we hire to do it, to make sure we're managing a reasonable workload? Are we making sure we're providing the wellness and mental health resources people need who are exposed to this stuff to help them cope and make sure that, hey, they're doing the diligent job of protecting people from potentially horrible things? And we do that in other areas. So how do we make sure that we're being the voice at the table that's saying, let's make sure we're taking this into account and doing something with it, and not just dismissing it as no big deal, something that we'll figure out later type of a thing. You can be part of the conversation, regardless of where you sit in your organization. And you can bring more awareness on social. If I look at social media, there is so much stuff about how amazing, how wonderful, how great everything is, almost completely ignoring the reality that, hey, I'm not telling people to stop or to turn this whole stuff off. I'm just saying, let's do this carefully and with wisdom and discernment. And you too can participate in that conversation to try and create greater awareness that there's more complexity and nuance to this situation than we always realize. And let's just take the time to make sure we're thoroughly exploring that. And that's something you don't need to be some big social media influencer to be able to have that conversation on a personal level at your work, things like that. And I would just encourage that from anyone who is involved or even just has a role or just in general. Making people aware helps people make better decisions. So the third one, let's transition over to number 3, which is the implications on diversity and equity. Now, I know that the 3 of these, or for sure 2 of these, could easily get into a political discussion. And I am really not trying to do that. This is not about getting political on this. But the sound reality is diversity and equity is good for everyone. I've seen this through my entire career that when we raise the tide for everyone, we all win. And that may sound like just a gross oversimplification or this pie in the sky altruistic mentality. The reality is, I've seen the data to back this up. When we actually emphasize equity and bringing in diverse perspectives and representing underrepresented folks, everyone wins. Now, what you go, well, what does this have to do with advanced AI? While the tech seems groundbreaking and new, and you type something into ChatGPT and go, wow, like look how fast and quickly it did it. You've got to remember the data models that these things are built on are lagging significantly. Okay, so as an example, I'm trying to think which version of ChatGPT, but it's being trained on data from 2021 or something like that. So, right, there's a lag. There's a significant lag in the data sets that are happening. Now, just think about the last few years. A lot can change in a couple of years. So the dominant voices in the world, the dominant topics in the world, the perspective on things, all these things can change significantly over that period of time. And so what can happen is when training data is built on data from years past, you have to remember that like it's not currently up to date and there are going to be things missing from that. And so what it's going to do is perpetuate things from years past, which in some cases can be really good. In some cases, it can be really destructive. On top of that, you have to consider the fact that as it's building these models, as it's starting to understand and build what it's doing, what the dominant voice is going to heavily influence. And are there ways you can tweak the algorithms to try not to let majority voices dominate? There are, but the reality is, as these kind of things creep in here, sometimes voices just flat out aren't represented because lack of access to tech or geographic or socioeconomic. Like this is not, again, political. This is just reality that these unfortunate circumstances lead to the training data that these algorithms are being built on. They're not perfect. They're not perfect. And sometimes we don't even realize how imperfect they are until it's already been built. And then people go, well, we really need to fix this. And it's like, well, we can, but remember there's a 2-year lag because the whole thing that we built this on is from 2 years ago. And now to do it again, we'd have to pull all new things. Again, not inherently bad, but there are implications that we need to consider as this. Because what can happen is the powerful voices can just continue getting more powerful. The less powerful voices, as everyone starts looking to generative AI to define this from 2 years ago, suddenly it's a lot harder for new voices to break into the space, which that's not good for society and things like that. And so when we think about it, we don't always represent other points of view when these minority voices don't make it. And again, to be clear, I'm not only talking about cultural minority. I'm talking about minority thinking, folks that are just thinking differently, who aren't this topic, ethics in generative AI. That's not the majority of conversations happening on that right now. So we have to think about this. How is that being accounted for? And all of these other factors. So again, there's some real diversity and equity imbalances that are naturally baked into the system that we have to watch out for. Again, if you haven't figured out already, my point in talking about this is not to be apocalyptic and doomsday and shut the thing down before we end the world. I actually see a lot of bright futures in what we're doing. But if we're not aware of the risks, we're going to walk right past them and they're going to catch us on the tail end. And that's not a good place to be playing from. And so what I'm trying to do is to create awareness of this. And these diversity and equity risks, they're real. So again, what do we do about it? Well, let's just be, if you're a tech leader, again, I'm kind of targeting the audiences. If you're a tech leader, be really cognizant of this as you look at the data models and the data sets that you're using to train your AI. Like, think about how you're adjusting the volume on different things to do your best. I recognize it's an almost impossible task to say, well, can we get it right? I recognize we're never going to get it right. And to those of you who are listening who may not be in that space going, well, why can't we just fix that? There is way more complexity to it than most people even realize. And so to those of you in the tech space, I recognize you are trying your best, but just don't give up on that and continue to put an intentional lens on this and going back to, hey, sometimes the pressure is just rush the product out. Slow down. Consumers, you can slow down. Tech leaders, slow it down. Don't rush things through and say, you know what, we probably did good enough. This is an area that, again, we need to pay pay high attention to. And actually, here's the other thing. As a tech leader, intentionally seek the voices out who you know are going to be underrepresented in these data sets to look for this stuff. We often are just blind to our own stuff. And so this is a way to say, well, make sure the teams that are responsible for looking for these things and evaluating, hey, where are vulnerabilities? What volumes do we need to turn up and which ones do we need to turn down? Make sure that that's representative of the diversity and equity we're trying to create in the world. Because if we don't, this is only going to make the system worse. It's just going to become another systemic problem that we're not going to know how to put out. Now, if you're not in that space and you're going, okay, what about the rest of us? Pretty much everyone in the corporate space I know, and even consumers now, are at this point where they're evaluating and purchasing AI tech. You may not even realize it. But as you think about this, ask these questions. Look into some of this stuff. How are they actually coming up? What are the generative AI models that they're using? Where are they pulling from? Ask questions about how these things are trained. And I get that's not easy to do, but even the sheer act of asking about it, going back to companies do what consumers want. If everyone is asking, hey, how are you training your AI? What AI tools are you using to do this? How are you ensuring that you're not building more bias and inequity into the system through this? People keep asking those questions. Companies are going to listen because they know it's going to become an area of focus. Also, here's the other big one that anybody in the corporate space should be considering is build in human fail safes to catch this stuff. One of the worst things that I have seen organizations do as they get excited about automation and AI is they go too far with it. They go too far and they turn over decisions and work and critical thinking to the machines, not thinking some of these things through. And they don't build in the necessary human fail safes to check the checks and balances that you need. So make sure whenever you're considering using AI products, make sure you have fail safes. Make sure you have people involved in that to check over this stuff, to make sure that this doesn't get out of hand and that they're watching the dials and making sure nothing's going too far out. Because if you don't, this will, and I have seen it, blow you up in ways you are not thinking about right now. And it will be something that will be far harder for you to come back from than you realize. Again, going back to the other things. And again, two other things on this. Include those minority reports, those minority voices. Again, not just talking culturally, but pick the people that you know are going to be the difficult ones to be part of the conversation. I know that sounds counterintuitive, yeah, but that's going to get in the way of progress. Well, in some ways, yeah, you want things slowing down progress and building fail safes in that you go, well, that just is getting in the way. Sometimes things need to get in the way to protect you from things that you're not seeing around the corner. And also just think about how you're incorporating. Be really intentional in this. Just because something promises to do amazing things doesn't mean you should hand it over to that. There's this level of how far are we willing to sacrifice for convenience? or speed or performance. There has to be a line and we have to draw it. And if we don't, we're going to scorch the earth. So just some things to think about with that. These risks are real. The consequences are severe. So take the time to think about it. And if anything, slow down and bring those voices to the table so that you can be thinking about these things that would be easy to dismiss, write off, or say are getting in the way of what you're trying to accomplish. All right, the last and final, and by the way, I have 4 here. These are not the only ethical concerns that I have for this technology, but these are 4 of the biggest ones that come to mind for me as we get into it. So the last one that I have here is really societal and workplace readiness. Like I said, this came onto the main stage like a Learjet. I mean, it just blasted through and it's not slowing down. And that's the thing. It's just, and so people are trying to catch up. And sometimes what happens when people are trying to catch up, they're just running so fast, they aren't even thinking about what they're running towards and what the implications of all this stuff. And so most people and companies, they're not prepared for it. And the reasons I alluded to above, yeah, those are some of the really important reasons that they're not ready for it. But there's a lot of other things. And some of it is just everyone is so distracted by everything else going on. Everyone is so overwhelmed. The pace of change is so high that sometimes the thought of a breath of fresh air to come to the surface and be able to breathe, people will cling to it without thinking like, is this the right thing to be clinging to? And so I just want to slow folks down on this. Now, let me just say, I've seen 2 polarized responses to some of these concerns, and I want to speak to both of them on this. The one is just running blindly, which is what I was just talking about. People are either so desperate or for relief, or so desperate to pursue performance, progress, whatever, that it's just like, I don't even care. We'll figure that out later. Then you've got the other side, which is let's just avoid this thing at all costs. So I want to address both ends of the spectrum, which anybody who listens to my stuff, by now you know that a lot of times I find myself in the murky middle, and that's not me riding the fence. It's just me recognizing there's a whole lot of complexity to this stuff that most people just don't realize or don't know how to navigate. So on the running in blindly, I mean, by now, the 3 things I illuminated earlier, hopefully at least have you going, all right, okay, there's legitimacy to this. Maybe we should just slow it down. But the other thing with this is that I really have a personal attachment to as a learning leader is we don't always talk about the risk of people becoming over-reliant on it. I was reading an article about that this morning, about the over-reliance people have on this. And again, going back to like the thought of, man, wouldn't it be just great if I didn't have to do this anymore? Is the over response versus the, well, I don't trust it, I'm never going to do this. But the problem is, like GPS, it can make people dumber. And I don't say that in this arrogant, pompous way. I just say the reality is the less you use your brain, it's like a muscle. The less you use it, the more it atrophies. And so if we become over reliant on AI algorithms doing everything for us and not thinking critically about what is it doing? How is it doing it? I need to have a voice and thought and process involved in that. It's going to actually weaken you. And so again, this can go back to like where people run blindly. There's a kind of component to this where you can run blindly. But if you don't understand this, you're not strengthening that muscle. You're avoiding it. And in both cases, it atrophies. And that's not a good place to be with something this powerful moving this quickly. We need everybody to be in like Olympic athlete shape to know how to navigate and wrestle with this thing. And that's where right now society's like couch potato version right now. We got the, couch potato version of work and humanity. And we've got a need for us to be Olympic athletes. And so, yes, we've got a bridge to go, but even content like this and hopefully encouraging people to push this will continue to do this. Now, for the folks who may be reacting to it, like I said, my one point to the folks who go, well, your reaction is I'm just going to stay out of this thing. First of all, one, you're going to atrophy in terms of your ability to navigate things because the world is going to change as a result of this. And you don't live in a world that's changed by just trying to avoid it all. But the other thing is you are putting yourself at risk and you're leaving these decisions to other people. And you are that minority voice that needs to be at the table. We need those healthy skeptics who are challenging things, who are questioning things, who are pushing back on all of this stuff. And if you just quietly sit by and go, I hate it, I'm staying out of the conversation, I'm just backing out, then you're leaving those majority voices to dominate the conversations and essentially just letting this happen. And you're going to be the recipient of the downfall. That's the thing with it. You may say, I'm just going to avoid. Well, you're not going to avoid it. It's just you're going to reap the consequences of it and not have a voice at it. So as that minority voice, I would just encourage you to be more involved in this and resist that urge to go, this is terrifying or it's overwhelming or I don't like it, so I'm just going to stay away. I mean, just to give you an example in this, hey, AI quickly made its way into hiring decisions. Okay, as things were going, the way it was analyzing and assessing talent, and then how those people were being served up in this. And I've been involved in many discussions at companies where they're looking for ways to automate and use AI in their hiring. And a lot of times you go down this path, and what can happen if you're not careful is I'm talking to you, the person who's like, I'm just staying out of it because if I stay out of it, I don't have to deal with it. Now you go try to find a job and you haven't been a voice or you aren't even aware how these algorithms are influencing things. You now feel like, why is it I can't actually move? Why can't I make progress? And the reality is, well, the system's stacked against you. And because you've chosen to opt out, you're not only unaware of it, but you have no defenses for fighting against it. And so this is one of those things that, just as an example, care about this enough to do something about it and not armchair quarterback, complain about it, or just straight up opt out. I mean, really the biggest risk when it comes to advanced AI, the biggest risk is people failing to understand how it works and what it does. And they end up, as a result, putting too much faith in it or not asking any questions or not thinking critically, right? We either blindly dump ourselves into it, don't ask questions, don't think critically on it, or we just avoid it. I mean, those are real risks. And that often happens when people don't understand something. Again, those are the polar responses. So for those of you who are listening, watching this, be a voice. Heck, you don't even need to be the voice. Share this video if you want. Post it on social. Speak up when you see opportunity. And you don't have to be the one to do it. Part of the reason I speak so much on these things is so that I can be the voice for other people. And it's like, you don't have to be the one to say it. Just go, hey, I saw this and thought this may be something we should consider. The reality is, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And you can't complain about something you're unwilling to get involved in. And that's the thing. For HR and business leaders, think critically about this as you're building jobs, as you're thinking about your hiring, as you're thinking about how you assess skills and the impact of AI. We can't be the tail on the dog as it comes to this. We need to be ahead of it. We need to understand how this AI is working, how it's changing work, so that we can be building jobs and influencing our business leaders on how should we think about this? How should we assess success on these jobs in a world where things look different than they did before? Build the jobs for the future, not for today, because at the pace this is moving, by the time you built the job, it's already too late. So you have to be jumping ahead. If you're a learning leader watching or listening to this, you have an opportunity to lean in and prepare the workforce. Like I just said before, one of the biggest risks is not knowing and not knowing what to do. And as a learning leader, you are perfectly positioned to build programs and help prepare the workforce for what this looks like. You can prioritize digital acumen. You don't need to train people on how to build AI. I see that sometimes where people go, we need to raise the bar, and people freak out because they think we need to make everybody an AI engineer. And that's not the case. That is not the point. But people do need to have a sense of baseline knowledge of how this stuff works. What are the risks? What kinds of things would be over-reliance? How do we walk that line and use wisdom and discernment along the way? How do we continue pushing critical thinking skills? How are we tightly partnering with our tech and business leaders on how they're thinking about it? Again, as learning leaders, we should be ahead of the curve so we can help educate those around us. As a dad of 7, parents, I'm speaking to you too. Your kids are going to be this generation. And I have 7 of them. And this is a conversation that I have with them. I talk with them, and they're under 12, but I recognize the world they grow up in, the risk of them being over reliant on this, the risk of them just letting the machines do things for them and thinking, hey, what's the harm in this? This is great. They need to have these conversations and understand this. So if you're a parent, don't wait for them to get into the mess and have to clean it up. You can engage with them now and have conversations about this. Talk to them about things. I regularly sit and have exposed my kids. We talk about what ChatGPT can do, and we talk about how it can help augment what they do and where it might be taking it too far and what we might be able to do with things like that. So in conclusion, with all of these things, hopefully this is giving you some food for thought. Again, I want to reinforce, I'm really excited about this technology and where it's going, while at the same time being really cautiously optimistic. There are some serious dangers and risks associated with this. But like many things in history, good stuff comes with risk, and you don't address it by just avoiding it. You figure out what are those risks and how do we address them well. And I think this is the opportunity we have right now. I think we can all work together, and I would encourage everyone, let's work together to use this incredibly powerful technology with so much potential to do so much good. Let's just make sure it's being used for good, and the process that we get to it isn't scorching the earth along the way. So with that, hopefully you found this helpful. Hopefully it's challenged your thinking, caused you to just think deeper about things that you may not have even had awareness to or haven't thought were that big of a deal. Feel free to comment. Let me know if you have additional questions, additional thoughts. Happy to follow up. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.